They believed the Soviet Union would fall. They thought they could destroy it forever. But when the cold winds of the East returned, sweeping across the battle-worn lands of Europe, carrying the memory of lives lost in burned villages and silent woods, the world realized a truth it had not expected. The Soviet Union had endured. And more than that, it had awakened. The Eastern Front in 1945 was not just a war zone. It became the setting for one of history's most determined military counteractions. This is the story of how the Red Army overcame overwhelming hardship and helped bring an end to the most dangerous regime the world had known. It was the beginning of 1945, snow-blanketed Eastern Europe, where years of destruction had left deep scars. But the tide had turned. Out of the ruins of once devastated cities like Stalingrad and Kursk, a force had emerged. These were not just soldiers. They were individuals who had endured immense loss. They had seen their homes destroyed and families vanish. They now stood unified at the borders of Poland, ready to move forward. They were the survivors of an unforgiving conflict, disciplined, resolute, and unwavering. For the German forces, the campaign in the East had turned into a devastating reversal. Their early advances were gone. The plan to conquer Soviet lands had failed. Stalingrad had been reclaimed. Leningrad had endured a historic siege. The Soviet military had not only recovered, they had adapted. By January, two Soviet commanders, Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Ivan Konev, were prepared with more than 2 million troops. Their destination was Berlin. But first, they would move through every remaining German position, carrying with them the memories of what had been lost. The Vistula-Oder offensive marked the beginning of this drive. The Red Army moved swiftly, with tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft working in coordination. German defenses broke quickly. Towns and cities that had once stood as strongholds fell into ruins. In only 3 weeks, the Soviets had pushed more than 300 miles west. There was no pause, no celebration. This was not just a campaign. It was a mission of resolution. German military strength had diminished. Many defenders were too young or too old. They lacked training, they lacked resources, and they faced a Soviet force made of individuals hardened by years of war. Those marching westward had once fought under fire in the streets of Stalingrad. Their will had been shaped by perseverance and loss. They advanced not with anger, but with determination. In East Prussia, the situation grew more difficult. Civilian populations fled westward in the harsh winter. German soldiers attempted to resist but were steadily overwhelmed. The conflict now began to reach the heart of Germany itself. The echoes of earlier events, once inflicted upon others, were now returning home. The Soviet advance was not reckless. It was strategic. Each move, each direction, was part of a greater objective. By February, they had reached the Oder River. Berlin lay ahead. Stalin did not rush the final stage. Instead, he sought to isolate the city, to prevent escape, to ensure its capture. This was to be a complete operation witnessed by the world. Behind the lines, Soviet infrastructure was fully active. Ammunition, supplies, and medical support moved rapidly. In cities far from the front, workers continued to fuel the army's momentum. Every person, whether on the battlefield or behind a machine, played a role. This was a collective effort, one goal shared by millions: bring an end to the war in Europe. Meanwhile, in Berlin, there was uncertainty. Leadership refused to accept how close the front line had come. Orders were given that no longer made sense. Decisions were based on hopes, not reality. But the facts could not be ignored. The Soviet army was advancing and nothing would hold them back. The town of Kustrin became a symbol. German forces fought fiercely to hold it, but the Red Army surrounded it, isolated it, and ultimately took it, building by building. When the battle ended, Kustrin was no longer a functioning town. It stood as a sign of what was to come. The final objective was Berlin. Hitler had fortified the city with what remained of his loyal forces, but many of the city's defenders were citizens, not soldiers. Still, the Soviets were determined. On April 16, 1945, They launched the largest artillery barrage of the war. Over 1 million shells marked the beginning of the Battle of Berlin. The city trembled under the force. Marshal Zhukov's forces faced difficult terrain and fierce resistance at Silo Heights. The German forces had prepared strong defenses, but the Soviet advance continued, pushing through with effort and sacrifice. South of Berlin, Marshal Konev's troops moved rapidly, threatening to encircle the city from behind. Berlin was becoming isolated. Inside the city, the situation was dire. Streets were blocked by rubble. Smoke filled the air. People sought shelter. The leadership called for continued resistance, but supplies were limited and hope was fading. The Red Army reached the city's edge by April 21st. What followed was urban warfare at its most intense. Every corner became contested ground. But the Soviet forces moved forward, steadily, surely. Even as the Soviet soldiers drew closer to the heart of Berlin, decisions in the bunker below remained disconnected from reality. Orders were issued to imaginary divisions. Promotions were given to individuals who could not turn the tide. Still, the world around the city was changing. On April 25th, Soviet and American troops met at the Elbe River. It was a historic moment, but for the Red Army, their mission in Berlin was not yet complete. The final phase began on April 28th. Street by street, block by block, they pressed forward. Resistance was fierce, but the outcome became increasingly clear. And on April 30th, the Soviet flag was raised above the Reichstag. It stood for all to see, torn, worn, but standing. That day, Berlin's chapter in the war came to an end. Soon after, the remaining German forces in the city surrendered. On May 8th, Germany officially capitulated. The war in Europe had ended. But the human cost was immense. The Soviet Union had lost more than 26 million lives. Entire cities were reduced to ruins. Families were torn apart. But the goal had been achieved. They had held the line. They had advanced. And they had prevailed. Yet behind this triumph were stories too complex to tell in full. Stories of pain, of survival, of people trying to rebuild what had been lost. The Eastern Front had been more than a battlefield. It had been a test of human endurance. As order was restored, peace did not come easily. The effects of the conflict lingered in every direction. The experiences of those who had served left lasting marks. Not every tale could be shared. Not every hardship could be healed quickly. But still, the region began to move forward. The Soviet Union's influence extended across Eastern Europe. A new era was beginning, one shaped not by battlefields but by diplomacy and politics. The Cold War followed. Yet the role the Red Army played in ending the global conflict remained a defining moment in world history. In Moscow, the victory was honored. Cities celebrated. Leaders praised the strength of the nation. But the real legacy belonged to the countless individuals who had made it possible. Those who had fought. Those who had endured. And those who had never returned. The war changed everything. It brought devastation. But it also revealed the power of unity, resilience, and purpose. The Soviet people had faced impossible odds and overcome them. They had stood against fear, and they had carried the hopes of a nation through one of the darkest periods of history. When history remembers World War II, it must remember the Eastern Front, the sacrifices made, the courage shown, and the people who refused to give in. The war was not only won through strategy, it was won through spirit, and the world would never be the same again.